A pale November sun struggled through the dense pine canopy, casting dappled light across the forest floor. The morning air carried the distinct bite of early winter, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but not yet brutal enough to drive away those who knew these woods. Frost clung to fallen leaves and dried bracken, crunching softly underfoot as the hunter moved with practiced silence through the familiar terrain. The hunter, a weathered man of 47 with deep crow's feet etched around alert eyes, had been traversing these same hunting grounds for nearly 2 decades. His movements were economical, honed by thousands of hours spent stalking game through the remote wilderness of northwestern Montana. Though he now carried a compound bow rather than the rifle he'd favored in his younger years, his approach remained unchanged, patience above all else. 15 years as a hunting guide before striking out independently had taught him to read this landscape like a familiar book. The dried riverbed to the east that flooded each spring, the elevated ridgeline to the north where white-tailed deer often bedded down, the thick bramble patches where grouse would startle at your approach. This was his office, his sanctuary, and his livelihood all in one. He paused to check the wind direction, wetting his finger and holding it up, a habit so ingrained he performed it without conscious thought. The forest smelled different today. Beyond the usual sense of pine sap, decomposing leaves and damp earth lay something acrid and foreign. He frowned slightly but continued his methodical progress toward a promising ridge where he'd set up a trail camera last week. Behind him at home, 20 miles away in the small rural community that served as the region's hub, his wife would be preparing for her shift at the medical center. Their daughter, away at college studying environmental science, had inherited his fascination with the natural world but channeled it into conservation rather than hunting. Their son, still in high school, straddled both worlds, accompanying his father on hunts while also volunteering with local wildlife rehabilitation efforts. The hunter felt a familiar pride warm his chest at the thought of his family. Yet today, something felt off-kilter. The forest was too quiet. Normally, even in the chill of approaching winter, chickadees would flit between branches, squirrels would rustle through fallen leaves, and the occasional distant woodpecker would drum against dead timber. This morning, however, the silence was profound, broken only by his own careful footsteps and the occasional whisper of wind through pine needles. The hunter had learned long ago to trust his instincts. Twice in his career, that sixth sense had saved him from potentially deadly encounters with injured bears. Once, it had warned him of an approaching wildfire before he could see or smell the smoke. Now, that same primal alarm bell rang faintly at the back of his mind. He adjusted the pack on his shoulders, checking that his emergency satellite phone was accessible. His wife had insisted he carry it after he'd broken his ankle 3 seasons back and had to drag himself 2 miles to his truck. The memory of her worry-creased face when he'd finally made it to the emergency room was enough to ensure he never left home without it. As he crested a small rise, he noticed several broken branches on an otherwise healthy pine. Not the clean snap of deer moving through underbrush, but the jagged, violent breaks of something larger, something that didn't belong. The hunter's pace slowed further as his senses heightened, scanning the terrain with renewed focus. The birds that should have been active at this hour were conspicuously absent. Even the persistent wind seemed to have died down, leaving an unnatural stillness hanging over this section of forest. The hunter had experienced similar phenomena near active wildfire zones or in the aftermath of landslides, but there were no obvious signs of either. He checked his GPS unit, confirming he was still within the boundaries of the national forest where he held his seasonal hunting permit. The unexplored ridge he was heading toward lay just a quarter-mile ahead, accessible by a game trail that wound through a particularly dense section of pine and fir. As he approached the tree line, that faint acrid smell grew stronger, metallic and chemical, wholly out of place in these woods. The hunter knelt to examine a patch of disturbed soil. Something heavy had passed this way recently, crushing undergrowth and displacing rocks. Not a bear or moose. The pattern was all wrong. More like something had been dragged, or had crashed through. The hunter abandoned his original course, curiosity overriding his planned route. Following the trail of broken vegetation and disturbed earth, he moved cautiously toward a small clearing he didn't remember from previous excursions. The smell grew stronger with each step, burning plastic, hot metal, and something else he couldn't quite identify, but that made his nose wrinkle in instinctive distaste. He stopped at the edge of the tree line, eyes widening at what lay before him. In the center of the small, natural clearing, partially obscured by felled trees and earth thrown up by impact, sat the unmistakable wreckage of a helicopter. Not a small civilian craft like the ones tourists sometimes hired for aerial photography, but something larger, more angular. Military possibly, or at least government issue. The hunter's first thought was to retreat and call emergency services immediately. His second, following close behind, was to check for survivors. The crash looked relatively recent. No significant plant growth had started to reclaim the impact site, and that acrid smell of fuel and hot metal still hung heavy in the air. He scanned the perimeter for any sign of movement or other observers before cautiously advancing. The helicopter had come down nose first, its tail section resting awkwardly against a massive old-growth pine that had likely prevented the craft from tumbling farther down the gentle slope. The main rotor blades were shattered, with fragments scattered across 30 yards of forest floor. The fuselage was crumpled but largely intact, no signs of fire damage or explosion. Most peculiarly, there were no markings on the matte black exterior, no registration numbers, no insignia, no identifying features whatsoever. In 18 years of hunting these woods, the hunter had occasionally seen military aircraft on training exercises from the nearby Air Force base, but those had always been clearly marked. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the crumpled side door, which hung partially open. The interior was dark, but he could make out what appeared to be electronic equipment, much of it smashed beyond recognition. This was no ordinary helicopter. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent clearing. "Anyone in there? Do you need help?" Nothing but the soft creak of settling metal answered him. Drawing a deep breath to steady himself, the hunter unsheathed his hunting knife, not as a weapon, but as a tool to help pry open the damaged door if necessary. The door gave way with surprising ease, swinging outward on bent hinges. The interior smelled of ozone and something medicinal that made his eyes water. There was no pilot in the cockpit, which struck him as odd given the lack of any obvious ejection mechanism. The control panel looked unlike anything he'd seen before. Fewer analog dials than he would have expected, replaced instead by darkened digital displays and what appeared to be touch interfaces now cracked and lifeless. Moving deeper into the craft, he found himself in what appeared to be a small laboratory setup. Metal cabinets lined one wall, some torn from their moorings by the impact. A reinforced case had sprung open, its contents, what looked like scientific equipment, scattered across the floor. What struck him most was the presence of a sealed containment unit still securely bolted to the floor despite the violence of the crash. The containment unit was roughly the size of a household refrigerator, constructed of some composite material with a small viewing window. The window was frosted over from the inside, preventing him from seeing its contents clearly. A digital readout on its side still glowed faintly green, displaying numbers that meant nothing to the hunter, but suggested the unit remained operational despite the crash. His hand moved instinctively toward the latch mechanism, then paused. Years in the wilderness had taught him caution. Whatever this was, it wasn't standard equipment for any search and rescue or Forest Service helicopter he'd ever encountered. Instead, he pulled out his phone to document what he was seeing. The reception was non-existent, as expected this deep in the national forest, but the camera worked fine. He took several photos of the exterior, the unmarked fuselage, the cockpit, and finally, the mysterious containment unit. As he focused on capturing the digital readout, a subtle movement caught his peripheral vision. The frost on the viewing window had begun to recede from the edges, gradually clearing to reveal what lay within. The hunter leaned closer, breath held, as the glass became transparent enough to see through. What he saw inside made him stumble backward, nearly dropping his phone. His mind struggled to process the images now burned into his consciousness. Inside the containment unit, suspended in some kind of clear solution, was biological material unlike anything he'd encountered in his decades studying wildlife. Not human, not animal, at least not any animal native to these mountains. The hunter's hand trembled as he snapped several more photos, knowing that without evidence, no one would believe what he'd found. His mind raced through possible explanations. Experimental military research, biological hazard containment, or something he dared not even formulate into coherent thought. Whatever it was, it clearly wasn't meant for public knowledge. The absence of markings, the remote crash site, the specialized equipment, all pointed to something classified, something secret. The hunter returned to his truck at a pace that sacrificed stealth for speed. his mind still reeling. After securing his hunting gear, he retrieved his emergency kit containing gloves, a flashlight, and several evidence bags he used for collecting biological samples from game. Not ideal for what he planned, but better than nothing. On the drive back to the crash site, using a rough service road that cut closer to the location, he debated his next actions. The responsible course would be to contact authorities immediately. Yet something held him back. The unmarked nature of the craft, the unusual equipment, the contents of that containment unit. His instincts, honed by years in the wilderness, warned him that this discovery might put him in danger if handled incorrectly. Back at the site, equipped with proper protective gear, the hunter began a more thorough examination. The helicopter's interior yielded 3 significant findings beyond his initial observations. First, a leather credential wallet wedged between seats contained identification documents unlike any government ID he'd seen before. The laminated card featured an embossed silver logo he didn't recognize. Not military, not NASA, not any branch of government he could identify. The name and photo sections appeared to have been deliberately damaged, rendering them illegible. Second, a waterproof case contained what looked like research notes, pages of data, graphs, and technical language well beyond his comprehension. What caught his attention were coordinates marked on several pages that corresponded to locations throughout the region, including areas restricted to public access. Third, and most disturbing, was a set of sample containers in a padded case. Each held what appeared to be biological specimens, tissue samples preserved in clear solution, labeled with alphanumeric codes rather than names. The specimens resembled nothing from his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. The hunter documented everything meticulously, photographing each item from multiple angles before carefully replacing them exactly as he'd found them. His mind worked through possibilities. Experimental biological research gone wrong, classified military technology being field-tested, or something even more unsettling. With daylight fading, he made his decision. The nearest Forest Service outpost was about an hour's drive from where he'd parked. He would report the crash, anonymously at first, and gauge their response before revealing his identity or what he'd found. The ranger station was closing as he arrived. A young officer, clearly eager to end his shift, barely looked up as the hunter described finding what appeared to be a downed aircraft in the national forest. Location? The officer asked, pulling out a standardized incident report form with obvious reluctance. The hunter provided coordinates from his GPS, deliberately placing them a quarter-mile off from the actual crash site. Any signs of survivors or bodies? The ranger's tone remained disinterested. Didn't get close enough to check, the hunter lied. Thought I should report it first. The ranger nodded, jotting notes with bureaucratic slowness. Could be one of the research drones from the university. They've been mapping forest density this season. He yawned. Or maybe those wildlife biologists tracking migration patterns. They lost contact with one of their helicopters last week. The hunter's pulse quickened. Did they? Anyone hurt? No idea. Not my department. The ranger stapled the form and tossed it into a wire basket, already overflowing with paperwork. We'll pass this along to the appropriate team. They'll check it out when they can. Been short-staffed since budget cuts. How soon will someone investigate? The hunter pressed. The ranger shrugged. With winter coming on and fire season just ended, could be days, maybe weeks if it snows. Unless you're reporting bodies or an environmental hazard, it's not high priority. The hunter nodded, thanked the officer, and left, frustration building. The casual dismissal confirmed his suspicions. Either the authorities were genuinely unaware of what had crashed in their forest, or someone was ensuring reports would be buried in bureaucracy. Back in his truck, he reviewed the photos on his phone. The images remained as unsettling as his first viewing. Whatever he had found wasn't standard government or military equipment. The biological samples, the specialized containment unit, the unmarked fuselage, all pointed to something far beyond routine operations. He drove toward home as darkness settled over the mountains, mind churning with possibilities. The responsible choice would be to delete the photos, forget what he'd seen, and let whatever government agency owned that helicopter handle their own mess. The smart choice for self-preservation would be to walk away completely. But the hunter had built his reputation on persistence and thoroughness. Those qualities had made him one of the most respected guides in the region before he'd transitioned to solo hunting and wildlife photography. They had helped him track injured animals across miles of difficult terrain when others would have given up. And now, those same instincts were driving him toward a decision that would irrevocably change his life. Instead of turning toward home, He pulled into the gravel lot of a roadside diner he frequented during hunting season. The place offered reliable Wi-Fi and the kind of anonymity that came with being a business catering to seasonal visitors. In the cab of his truck, he created a new email account using information that couldn't be traced back to him. He selected 3 of the most conclusive photos: the unmarked helicopter exterior, the strange equipment, and most importantly, the contents of that containment unit that had made his blood run cold. His finger hovered over the send button. Once these images reached their destination, a journalist he'd read who specialized in government transparency issues, there would be no going back. The hunter took a deep breath, thinking of his family, his livelihood, and the 2 decades he'd spent building his quiet life in these mountains. Then he thought of what he'd seen in that containment unit, what it might mean, what could happen if he stayed silent. He pressed send. Back at home, the hunter moved through his evening routine mechanically, storing gear, showering, preparing a simple meal. His wife, returning from her hospital shift, noticed his distraction, but attributed it to a disappointing day in the field when he mentioned he hadn't taken any game. "You're pale," she observed, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Coming down with something?" "Just tired," he replied, unable to meet her eyes directly. Long day, rough terrain. That night, sleep eluded him. His mind replayed every detail of his discovery, questioning his actions, his interpretations, his decision to send those photos. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up on rest altogether and moved to his home office, where he began researching helicopter designs, government research projects, and classified aircraft reports. By dawn, he had filled a notebook with observations and questions, cross-referencing what he'd seen against publicly available information. Nothing matched precisely, but the patterns were clear enough to confirm his initial suspicion. Whatever had crashed in his hunting grounds was not supposed to be found by civilians. As the first light of morning filtered through his window, the hunter made his decision. He would return to the crash site, properly equipped this time, and gather more concrete evidence before the authorities arrived to sanitize the area. Something told him he might already be too late. The county records office occupied the basement level of a century-old brick courthouse in the center of the small town that served as the region's administrative hub. The hunter had passed the imposing building hundreds of times, but had never had reason to enter before today. The massive oak doors groaned in protest as he pushed through into the climate-controlled interior, where the scent of aged paper and furniture polish hung in the air. A wall-mounted directory guided him downstairs, where fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a clinical glow over rows of metal filing cabinets and microfiche readers that appeared untouched since the 1980s. The records clerk, a woman in her 60s with silver-framed glasses and a cardigan despite the building's warmth, barely looked up from her crossword puzzle as he approached. "Need something?" she asked, her tone suggesting she hoped the answer would be no. "Looking for historical records," the hunter explained. "Specifically, any documentation of unusual incidents or restricted operations in the national forest, military testing, research stations, anything like that from the last 50 years or so." The clerk's pencil paused mid-letter. "That's pretty broad. County records aren't organized by unusual incidents." Her expression softened slightly at his evident disappointment. "But we do have topographical surveys going back to the 1940s, Forest Service reports, and local newspaper archives on microfiche. Might find something there if you know what you're looking for." The hunter spent the next 3 hours methodically working through dusty file drawers and scrolling through microfiche frames that made his eyes burn. Most records proved mundane. Timber surveys, wildlife population reports, maps of fire damage through the decades. But persistence eventually yielded results in the form of a slim file labeled Incident Reports, Federal Land Use, 1975-1985. Within that folder, he discovered a series of formal complaints filed by local ranchers and hunters about unusual activity in a remote section of the national forest, the same general area where he'd discovered the helicopter. The complaints documented strange lights, unmarked vehicles, and most notably, a period of several months in 1978 when a 5-square-mile section of forest was completely closed to the public under the authority of an unspecified federal agency. The hunter photographed these documents with his phone, paying particular attention to a hand-drawn map that had been included with one rancher's complaint. The map marked an area labeled New Activity Zone, about 12 miles north of where he'd found the crashed helicopter. A memo from the Regional Forest Service supervisor, dated October 1979, instructed all staff to redirect any further inquiries about the restricted area to a Washington, D.C. phone number that had been disconnected long ago. Finding what you need? The clerk's voice startled him. The hunter closed the file quickly. Just historical research. Working on a book about land use in the region. She nodded without particular interest. There's more comprehensive material over at the Historical Society if you're serious about research. They've got private collections donated by old-time forest rangers and survey teams. Stuff that never made it into official records. The Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian home on the town's quieter east side. Unlike the sterile records office, this building embraced its antiquity, creaking floorboards, musty corners, and glass display cases housing artifacts from the region's development. The curator, a retired history professor with elbow patches on his tweed jacket, proved surprisingly enthusiastic about the hunter's inquiries. Military activities in the forest? Oh, absolutely, the curator confirmed, leading him through narrow hallways to a research room lined with bookshelves. From the 1950s through the late 1980s, various branches conducted operations they never fully disclosed. Most locals assumed it was just Cold War paranoia, but some incidents defied conventional explanation. The curator retrieved a leather-bound journal from a locked cabinet. This belonged to the district ranger who oversaw that section from 1974 to 1981. He documented everything, official and unofficial. After his death, his daughter donated his papers to us, rather than the Forest Service archives. Said her father wanted an independent record preserved. The journal documented the ranger's growing concern about activities occurring beyond his jurisdiction, yet within his forest. He described a facility constructed in 1977, officially designated as a weather monitoring station, but requiring security clearances far beyond what typical meteorological research would warrant. Most significantly, the journal contained several black and white photographs. One showed a concrete bunker-like structure nestled into a hillside, nearly invisible except for a large ventilation system and satellite array. Another captured what appeared to be a helicopter, remarkably similar to the one the hunter had discovered, landing in a cleared area beside the bunker. The final pages of the journal expressed the ranger's frustration at being denied access to parts of his own jurisdiction, followed by a cryptic entry dated March 1981. Third incident this month. Same pattern. No official explanation offered. They're removing something from deep in the earth, or bringing something in. Either way, it's not minerals, timber, or any resource I recognize. Whatever's happening goes far beyond routine military operations. The curator watched as the hunter carefully photographed these pages. His daughter said he became increasingly paranoid in his final years. Started carrying a Geiger counter on his inspections, convinced they were conducting radiation experiments. Forest Service pushed him into early retirement in '81. Official reason was health concerns. Did anyone investigate after he left? The hunter asked. The facility was allegedly decommissioned in 1987. Environmental assessment teams found nothing concerning, according to official reports. The structures were supposedly dismantled. The curator adjusted his glasses. But hikers occasionally report concrete foundations visible in that area. Nothing appears on current Forest Service maps. Before leaving, the hunter studied a topographical map mounted on the wall, identifying the location described in the ranger's journal. It lay approximately 8 miles northwest of where he'd found the crashed helicopter, in a section of the forest characterized by steep ravines and minimal trail access, an ideal location for activities meant to remain hidden. The hunter made one final stop before daylight faded completely. Following coordinates extrapolated from the old ranger's journal, he drove his truck as far as the deteriorating Forest Service road would allow, then hiked a quarter-mile to a vantage point overlooking a sheltered valley. Using binoculars, he scanned the opposite hillside where the bunker had once stood. At first, he saw nothing but dense pine forest, but as shadows lengthened with the setting sun, the altered topography became evident to his experienced eye. A too-perfect slope, vegetation patterns that didn't match the surrounding forest, concrete footings barely visible beneath decades of growth. Nature had reclaimed most of the site, but couldn't fully erase what had been built there. The hunter photographed what remained visible, using his highest zoom settings, then marked the location precisely on his GPS. Whatever connection existed between this abandoned facility and the crashed helicopter, he was now convinced they weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern spanning decades. Dawn had barely broken when the hunter returned to the helicopter crash site. this time equipped with more sophisticated documentation tools. Along with his standard hunting pack, he carried a professional-grade digital camera with multiple lenses, a handheld thermal imaging device purchased years ago for tracking wounded game, and a small drone with camera capabilities that his son used for wildlife photography. The forest felt different this morning, not silent like before, but watchful. Birds called from the canopy, but their patterns seemed erratic, unnatural. The hunter moved with heightened caution, scanning not just the ground for signs of animal passage, but also the surrounding trees and ridgelines for any indication of human presence. The crash site appeared undisturbed at first glance, the helicopter resting in the same position he'd left it 2 days earlier. Yet something felt off. The hunter circled the perimeter methodically before approaching, noting subtle discrepancies. Pine needles had been disturbed in a pattern inconsistent with natural wind dispersal. A fallen branch that had partially blocked the helicopter's side entrance had been moved. Someone had been here since his last visit. The hunter deployed his drone first, capturing aerial footage of the crash site and surrounding area from multiple elevations. The overhead perspective revealed something he hadn't noticed before, what appeared to be a narrow trail leading away from the crash site toward the north, visible only as a slight disruption in the forest canopy. The trail wasn't on any Forest Service map he'd studied. Once satisfied with the aerial documentation, he approached the helicopter directly. The side door hung at the same angle as before, but the interior had definitely been altered. The scattered equipment had been organized, some items clearly removed. The leather credential wallet he'd found was gone, as were the research notes with coordinates. Most significantly, the containment unit remained but had been powered down, its digital readout now dark. The viewing window was completely frosted over again, concealing whatever remained inside. When he touched the exterior, it felt neither warm nor cold, simply inert, as though whatever system had maintained its internal environment had been deactivated. The hunter photographed everything methodically, noting each discrepancy between his memory and current conditions. His documentation complete, he turned his attention to the narrow trail revealed by the drone footage. It was barely visible at ground level, not a maintained path, but a route created by repeated passage. Branches carefully trimmed just enough to allow movement without creating an obvious corridor. The trail led north for approximately half a mile before opening into a small clearing that contained a concrete structure partially embedded in the hillside. Unlike the abandoned facility he'd observed the previous evening, this installation appeared recently used. A modern keypad security system controlled access to a reinforced door. Ventilation systems hummed softly, indicating active climate control systems within. No windows were visible, and the exterior was designed to blend with the surrounding environment when viewed from a distance. If he hadn't been following the trail directly, he might have walked within 20 yards without noticing it. The hunter photographed the structure from multiple angles, careful to remain within the tree line rather than exposing himself in the clearing. A security camera mounted above the entrance tracked slowly from side to side, its housing weathered enough to suggest it had been in place for years rather than days. The hunter noted fresh boot prints in the soft earth around the entrance. Not casual hikers, but the distinctive treads of tactical footwear, similar to what military personnel or specialized law enforcement might wear. Moving carefully around the perimeter, he discovered a secondary entrance, a narrow vertical shaft with a ladder descending into darkness, covered by a metal grate secured with a padlock. This access point appeared designed for maintenance rather than personnel use, possibly connecting to ventilation or utility systems. The hunter's instincts screamed danger, yet professional curiosity drove him to document everything. Whatever connection existed between this facility and the crashed helicopter, both were clearly part of operations never meant for public knowledge. The unmarked helicopter, the biological samples, the containment unit, and now this hidden installation, all pointed to classified activities conducting in a forest officially designated for public recreation and managed wildlife habitat. Mindful of the security camera, he retreated into the forest and circled around to approach from the opposite side, where the hillside rose steeply above the bunker. From this elevated position, he could observe the entire clearing while remaining concealed among the pines. Using his thermal imager, he detected heat signatures indicating the facility extended significantly into the hillside, far larger than its modest entrance suggested. A heat bloom along the hillside above the visible structure revealed the likely location of additional ventilation systems concealed by vegetation. The hunter documented everything meticulously, transferring photos to an encrypted cloud storage account through his satellite phone as a precaution. Whatever he had stumbled upon clearly involved significant resources, sophisticated technology, and deliberate concealment from public oversight. The identical appearance of the helicopter he'd found to the one photographed in the 1970s suggested these operations had continued for decades, evolving but never truly ending. As the afternoon waned, he made one final pass around the perimeter, gathering GPS coordinates and landscape references to ensure he could locate the installation again. He collected soil samples from near the ventilation outputs, storing them in sealed evidence bags originally purchased for collecting game blood samples to test for chronic wasting disease. The hunter retreated as dusk approached, taking a circuitous route back toward his vehicle rather than retracing the path directly. Something told him this would not be his last visit, but also that his window for independent investigation might be closing rapidly. The hunter returned to find his truck exactly as he'd left it, at least initially. The locks were secured, nothing appeared disturbed. Yet years in the wilderness had honed his perception of subtle details. The driver's seat position had shifted slightly, the rearview mirror had been adjusted, and most tellingly, his hunting journal in the glove compartment had been moved, the leather binding now facing the opposite direction. Someone had searched his vehicle. Heart rate accelerating, he conducted a more thorough inspection. Nothing appeared to be missing, but tucked beneath his windshield wiper was a plain, white business card. One side was blank, the other bore a single typed line. Some discoveries are best left unreported. The implication was unmistakable. Not only had his vehicle been searched, but whoever was responsible knew exactly what he had discovered and wanted him to abandon his investigation. The lack of explicit threats suggested an attempt at professional intimidation rather than criminal intent, which aligned with his suspicion of government involvement. The hunter started his truck and drove several miles before pulling over to check his equipment. His camera appeared undamaged, but when he reviewed the memory card, he found that all photos of the hidden installation had been deleted. Only images of the helicopter crash site remained. Similarly, his drone's memory had been wiped completely. Fortunately, he had already uploaded the most significant images to his encrypted cloud storage through his satellite phone before returning to his vehicle. The attempted erasure of evidence only confirmed the significance of what he had discovered. Rather than returning home directly, the hunter drove to the Regional Forest Service headquarters, a larger facility than the local ranger station he'd visited initially. This office managed operations across 3 national forests and employed specialist teams for everything from wildlife management to fire prevention. The administrative assistant at the front desk directed him to the law enforcement division, where he found himself face-to-face with a senior ranger responsible for investigating illegal activities within forest boundaries. The officer, a man in his 50s with a military straight posture, listened to his account of discovering a crashed helicopter with apparent patience, but his eyes remained coldly evaluative. "We've already received a report about the helicopter," the officer stated once the hunter finished speaking. "In fact, a recovery team was dispatched yesterday." "Recovery team?" The hunter maintained a neutral expression despite his surprise. "From the Forest Service?" "Multiple agencies are involved when aircraft go down on federal land." The officer's response was practiced, revealing nothing. "FAA, NTSB sometimes, military if appropriate. Standard procedure." "What about the facility I found nearby?" the hunter pressed. "The bunker built into the hillside with active security systems. That's not standard for public forest land." The officer's expression didn't change, but a muscle tightened along his jaw. "There are numerous research installations throughout the forest, wildlife monitoring stations, geological survey equipment, university research projects, all properly permitted." "This wasn't wildlife monitoring." The hunter leaned forward. "And there was biological material in that helicopter that doesn't match any known species in this region." "Sir, I appreciate your concern as a citizen." The officer's tone shifted to something less professional, more dismissive. "But you're describing a routine scientific research helicopter that experienced mechanical failure. The unusual equipment you observed is standard for high-altitude atmospheric sampling. Nothing more exotic than that." "Then why was my vehicle searched? Why was this left on my windshield?" The hunter placed the blank business card on the desk between them. The officer glanced at it without touching it. "I couldn't speculate on that. Perhaps someone mistook your vehicle for another. Or this could be completely unrelated." The conversation continued in this vein for another 15 minutes, with the hunter providing specific details and the officer responding with increasingly bureaucratic dismissals. It became evident that no official acknowledgement or investigation would be forthcoming. As the hunter prepared to leave, frustrated but not surprised, the officer's phone rang. The brief conversation consisted mostly of the officer listening, occasionally saying, "Understood," before hanging up. "One moment before you go." The officer's demeanor shifted subtly. "I've just been informed that you've been taking photographs in restricted areas. I need to advise you that unauthorized photography of federal research installations is prohibited under multiple statutes. I haven't seen any signs marking restricted areas," the hunter countered. "The entire section is designated public land on every Forest Service map. Temporary restrictions can be implemented without signage during emergency operations. I strongly advise you to delete any photographs and cease your amateur investigation." The officer's expression hardened. "For your own safety. Some research areas contain environmental hazards, radiation, biological contaminants, things civilians aren't equipped to handle safely." The implied threat hung in the air between them as the hunter left the building. The officer hadn't explicitly ordered him to stop or threatened legal consequences, just strongly advised him to abandon his investigation for safety reasons. In the parking lot, the hunter noticed a young Forest Service employee watching him from beside a maintenance vehicle. Their eyes met briefly before the employee quickly looked away, busying himself with equipment in the truck bed. Something in that fleeting glance, concern rather than suspicion, caught the hunter's attention. Moving casually, the hunter approached as though heading to his own vehicle parked in the same row. As he passed, the young maintenance worker spoke without looking up. "The helicopter isn't the first," he said quietly, continuing to arrange tools in his truck. "3 others in the past decade. Always the same response, always classified, always cleaned up within 48 hours. The hunter paused, pretending to check something in his pocket. "You've seen them?" "Helped transport equipment for one recovery operation 2 years ago. Told it was a weather research craft." The young man glanced around nervously. "Saw the same containers you described. Was ordered to forget what I'd seen. Most people do." "Why are you telling me this?" "My uncle was a ranger here in the 70s. Kept journals about strange activities in the forest. Died of an aggressive cancer 6 months after being forced into retirement. Too many coincidences." The maintenance worker closed his truck toolbox with deliberate casualness. "Whatever you found, they're already moving it. Tonight." Heavy equipment was requisitioned, special teams brought in from out of state. Before the hunter could respond, another Forest Service vehicle pulled into the lot. The maintenance worker immediately moved away, calling out a casual greeting to the new arrival that established distance between himself and the hunter. Driving home, the hunter's mind processed this new information. His investigation had triggered a response far more significant than local forest management would warrant for a simple crashed research helicopter. The span of decades, the consistent patterns of secrecy, the biological material, the hidden facility, all pointed to operations with national security implications. He arrived home to find a second message had been left, this time on his home computer. His browser had been opened to his cloud storage account, with all his uploaded photos and documentation still intact, but displayed on screen as though someone had been reviewing them. A text document had been created on his desktop with a more explicit message. "You've documented evidence of classified operations critical to national security. Possession and distribution of this material violates federal law. Final opportunity to cease activities without consequences. All evidence must be deleted within 24 hours. The hunter's wife noticed his tension during dinner, commenting on his distraction and unusual silence. He fabricated a story about tracking a wounded elk unsuccessfully all day, using the genuine frustration of his thwarted investigation to lend credibility to his explanation. Once his wife had gone to bed, the hunter established a systematic approach to preserving his evidence despite the escalating threats. He created multiple encrypted backups of all photos and notes, distributing them to secure cloud storage platforms under anonymous accounts. He packaged physical soil samples and printed photographs with a detailed written account, storing them in a waterproof container that he then concealed in his workshop beneath seemingly innocuous hunting equipment. Finally, he reached out to 3 separate contacts. First, the journalist to whom he'd initially sent photos, confirming receipt and arranging a secure method for transferring additional evidence. Second, an environmental testing lab in a neighboring state, requesting analysis of the soil samples he would ship anonymously. Third, a former hunting client who now worked for a federal oversight agency, composing a carefully worded message that outlined his discoveries without explicitly mentioning classified material. The hunter understood he had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning to his former life of quiet anonymity. Whatever he had discovered in that helicopter and the connected facility represented something powerful. Interests wanted kept secret. Whether it was illegal military testing, exotic biological research, or something even more extraordinary, the truth needed to be documented. He worked until the early hours of the morning, organizing everything he had learned into a coherent narrative with supporting evidence. Whatever happened next, whether authorities moved against him directly, denied everything, or attempted to discredit him, there would be multiple independent records of what he had discovered in the remote Montana wilderness. As dawn approached, the hunter made his final preparations to return to the facility one last time, determined to document whatever cleaning operation was planned for that night. Whatever secrets lay buried in those woods had remained hidden for decades. He intended to ensure they wouldn't remain buried for decades more. The hunter's garage workshop had always been his sanctuary, a place where he maintained equipment, processed game, and prepared for expeditions into the wilderness. Tonight, it felt like a war room. Spread across his workbench lay the tools for what might be the most significant hunt of his life: night vision goggles purchased years ago for predator control, a digital camera with infrared capabilities, his satellite phone with extra battery packs, a handheld GPS unit loaded with topographical maps of the area, and a small drone with night flight capability, borrowed from his son's wildlife photography equipment. Each item was methodically checked, batteries verified, functions tested. The hunter moved with the same deliberate precision he applied to preparing for backcountry expeditions, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the gravity of what he was undertaking. This wasn't tracking elk through mountain passes or following bear sign through dense forest. This was deliberately infiltrating what appeared to be a classified government operation, one that had already issued explicit warnings. On his computer, he recorded a 10-minute video, speaking directly to the camera with the measured cadence that characterized his professional guiding videos. He detailed everything he had discovered so far: the helicopter crash, the biological material in the containment unit, the hidden facility, the historical connections dating back decades, and the threats he had received. He concluded with his plans for tonight's observation mission, including precise GPS coordinates and timestamps. "If you're watching this," he said toward the end, his weathered face solemn in the screen's blue light, "then something has prevented my return. Everything I've documented is true. All evidence has been backed up to secure locations and distributed to multiple trusted contacts. The truth needs to be known, whatever the personal cost." The video completed, he encrypted it and programmed it to automatically send to 5 separate recipients, including the journalist, his federal oversight contact, and his brother-in-law, a corporate attorney in Chicago, if he didn't enter a cancellation code within 24 hours. The hunter paused before leaving the workshop, retrieving a small metal box from a locked cabinet. Inside lay a compact 9mm handgun and 2 magazines, a precaution he carried when guiding clients in grizzly country. He rarely needed it for wildlife. Tonight, his concerns were different. After a moment's hesitation, he secured the weapon in his pack, not as an offensive tool, but as last resort insurance should escape become necessary. In the kitchen, his wife was preparing to leave for her night shift at the medical center. She paused, sensing something in his demeanor, despite his attempts to project normalcy. "Another night expedition?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes searching his face. "Trail camera maintenance," he replied, the prepared explanation coming easily. "Got some unusual movement patterns recorded last week. Might be that mountain lion the conservation officers have been tracking." She nodded, familiar with his occasional night excursions for wildlife monitoring. "Check in when you're heading home? Service is spotty up there, I know, but I'll message as soon as I'm back in range," he promised, embracing her with unusual intensity. For a moment he considered telling her everything: the discovery, the threats, the risks he was taking tonight. But involving her would only create additional danger. Better she remain genuinely unaware should anyone come asking questions. After she left for her shift, the hunter made one final call to his former hunting client, who now worked in federal oversight. The call went to voicemail as expected. "It's your guide from the 2018 elk season," he said simply. "Just confirming our conversation about unusual wildlife observations in the northern section. I'm sending additional documentation tonight. Multiple species involved. Requires immediate expert attention. Location data included. The coded message would make little sense to anyone else, but would alert his contact that significant evidence was forthcoming. The hunter had deliberately cultivated relationships with clients in strategic positions over the years, not for business advantages, but because his conservation work occasionally required navigating bureaucratic channels. As darkness settled over the mountains, the hunter loaded his equipment into his secondary vehicle, an older model pickup with minimal electronic systems that he used for rough backcountry roads. Less comfortable than his main truck, but also less trackable. He took a circuitous route toward the national forest, watching his mirrors for any sign of surveillance, occasionally pulling off onto service roads to verify he wasn't being followed. The night air carried the first serious bite of approaching winter as he parked at an unmarked trailhead several miles from his target. This approach would require a longer hike, but would avoid the more obvious access points that might be monitored. The weight of his pack pressed against his shoulders as he moved into the trees, his headlamp dimmed to the minimum necessary illumination. The forest at night was a different world, one the hunter knew intimately from decades of dawn hunts and dusk stalks. Tonight, however, familiar territory felt foreign. Each shadow harbored potential threats. Every snapping twig triggered heightened alertness. The normal sounds of the nocturnal forest, owls calling, small mammals rustling through underbrush, were absent near the facility, creating an unnatural pocket of silence that grew more pronounced as he approached. The hunter established an observation position on a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the hidden facility while offering both cover and multiple escape routes. Through his night vision equipment, the scene below unfolded with eerie clarity. The previously quiet bunker had transformed into a hive of activity. Multiple vehicles, unmarked SUVs with government plates and two larger transport trucks, were parked in a perimeter around the entrance. Powerful portable lights illuminated the clearing, and a team of at least 12 individuals in unmarked tactical gear moved with military precision between vehicles and the facility entrance. Most concerning was the arrival of a helicopter nearly identical to the crashed one he had initially discovered. It landed in the cleared area, rotors whipping the surrounding vegetation. The side door opened to reveal not a standard cabin, but the same laboratory configuration he had seen in the wreckage. Specialized equipment and what appeared to be another containment unit. The hunter activated his drone, launching it from his concealed position and piloting it to hover at the edge of the tree line, just close enough to capture high-resolution video without being easily spotted against the night sky. The drone's infrared camera transmitted imagery to his tablet, revealing heat signatures throughout the facility that extended deep into the hillside, far larger than surface indications suggested. A team emerged from the bunker entrance carrying what appeared to be the containment unit from the crashed helicopter. Even from this distance, the hunter could see it was now fully operational, its viewing window clear enough to reveal the contents within. The biological material was more distinct now, partially obscured by preservation fluid but unmistakably organic. Not mammalian, not reptilian, but something with a cellular structure unlike anything in known taxonomic classifications. The hunter's hands trembled slightly as he documented everything: the personnel, the equipment, the containment unit's contents now clearly visible in his telephoto lens. Whatever this material was, it represented either an undiscovered Earth species with biology radically different from all known life forms, or something truly extraordinary, biological material of non-terrestrial origin. As the team transferred the containment unit to the waiting helicopter, a secondary group emerged from the bunker with multiple cases of what appeared to be soil and rock samples. The methodical collection and preservation methods matched protocols he'd observed university researchers use for delicate ecological specimens, but the security presence and unmarked vehicles spoke to something far beyond academic research. The hunter continued recording, his satellite phone simultaneously uploading encrypted data packets to his secure storage accounts. Whatever happened tonight, the evidence would survive. He zoomed his camera to capture identifying features of the vehicles, the equipment, and most importantly, clear images of the biological material now being loaded onto the helicopter. A sudden gust of wind shifted the drone slightly, causing its stabilization lights to flash momentarily. The hunter immediately adjusted, but the damage was done. One of the tactical team members pointed upward, then raised what appeared to be a signal jammer toward the drone. The hunter's control tablet flickered, connection destabilizing. He managed to capture a final close-up of the containment unit before initiating the drone's return protocol and powering down his tablet. Below, the team's behavior changed instantly. Two members jogged toward the tree line, tactical lights sweeping the forest. Another spoke into a communications device, gesturing toward the hillside where the hunter was positioned. The loading operation accelerated, personnel moving with increased urgency. The hunter had seconds to decide, retreat immediately or capture final documentation. He chose the latter, focusing his camera on the containment unit as it was secured in the helicopter. The zoom lens revealed details he hadn't been able to distinguish before, cellular structures visible through the preservation fluid, organized patterns that suggested neither random mutation nor known evolutionary development. The implications were staggering. A tactical light swept past his position, missing him by meters but signaling that the search perimeter was expanding rapidly. Time to move. The hunter packed his equipment with practiced efficiency, prioritizing the camera containing the most significant evidence and the satellite phone still transmitting data. The returning drone would have to be abandoned, a sacrifice worth making given what he had documented. He retreated along his pre-planned escape route, moving parallel to the ridge rather than directly away from the facility. Years of stalking prey through this terrain had taught him how to move silently, using natural features to break line of sight. Behind him, he heard vehicles starting, orders being shouted, the helicopter's rotors accelerating toward liftoff. The hunter maintained his disciplined pace despite the adrenaline urging him to run. Running created noise, left obvious tracks, and burned energy needed for sustained evasion. Instead, he moved with purpose through the densest sections of forest, using dry creek beds and rocky outcroppings to minimize his trail. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, multiple teams moving through the forest with tactical coordination that confirmed his suspicions about their military training. Flashlight beams cut through the trees behind him, accompanied by the crackling of portable radios. They were organizing a search grid, methodically eliminating potential escape routes. The hunter's lungs burned as he navigated a steep ravine, his boots slipping on loose shale. His heart hammered against his ribs, but decades in the wilderness had conditioned him for exactly this kind of physical stress. He paused briefly at the ravine bottom, controlling his breathing as he listened for pursuit. The teams were spreading out, but their movement patterns suggested they didn't have his exact location, only a general search area. A helicopter, not the laboratory transport but a lighter search model, appeared overhead, its powerful spotlight sweeping the forest canopy. The hunter pressed against the ravine wall, the natural overhang providing momentary concealment. The aircraft circled once, twice, then moved eastward, away from his actual position. They were guessing, casting a wide net rather than tracking specific signs. The hunter continued his retreat, now angling toward a section of the forest where old-growth trees created a denser canopy that would complicate aerial observation. His familiarity with the terrain provided critical advantages: knowledge of seasonal game trails, awareness of which creek crossings minimized trackable signs, recognition of natural features that offered concealment. 2 hours into his evasion, the sounds of organized pursuit had faded, replaced by the normal nocturnal forest sounds, a positive sign that he had either outpaced his pursuers or moved beyond their search perimeter. Still, he maintained his cautious progress, using stars for orientation when visible through breaks in the canopy, supplemented by occasional brief checks of his GPS. By the time he reached the secondary extraction point, an abandoned fire road 3 miles from his original parking location, dawn was breaking across the eastern ridgeline. The hunter emerged from the tree line cautiously, scanning for any sign of vehicles or personnel before approaching the concealed ATV he had positioned the previous day as emergency transportation. The machine started on the first attempt, its electric motor virtually silent compared to gas-powered alternatives. The hunter mounted and accelerated down the overgrown road, the first genuine sense of relief washing over him, as distance accumulated between himself and the facility. His primary documentation equipment was intact. The satellite transmissions had completed successfully. Most importantly, he had captured irrefutable evidence of what the containment units held. He reached his truck without further incident, quickly secured the ATV in the bed under a camouflage tarp, and transferred his equipment to the locked toolbox. Only then did he allow himself a moment to process what he had witnessed. The biological material in those containment units represented something beyond conventional science, something that would reshape humanity's understanding of life itself. The implications were profound enough that the extensive security apparatus made perfect sense. This wasn't merely classified military technology or illegal testing operations. This was discovery with the potential to fundamentally alter humanity's conception of its place in the universe. The diner just off the interstate served as neutral ground, public enough to ensure safety, anonymous enough to avoid attention. The hunter arrived first, selecting a booth with clear sightlines to both entrances and the parking lot. He ordered coffee, appearing to any observer as just another early morning traveler taking a break from the road. 20 minutes later, a woman entered, mid-40s, carrying a laptop bag and scanning the room with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating environments. The national investigative journalist had flown in overnight after receiving the hunter's encrypted file transfer. Her reputation for exposing government overreach and corporate malfeasance had made her the logical recipient for what he had discovered. No greetings were exchanged as she slid into the booth opposite him. Both understood the protocols of sensitive information exchange. "I reviewed your preliminary materials," she began, her voice low but conversational to any potential eavesdroppers. "Compelling but incomplete, could be interpreted multiple ways." The hunter nodded, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Complete documentation, multiple formats, authenticated timestamps, GPS coordinates embedded in the metadata." The journalist secured the envelope in her laptop bag without examining the contents. "The biological material. You're certain about its nature?" "I've studied wildlife in this region for over 20 years. Tracked, photographed, and documented every native species. This doesn't match any known taxonomic classification." The hunter met her gaze steadily. "The cellular structure, organization patterns, preservation methods, all point to the same conclusion, which you're reluctant to state explicitly. Not a question. Because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," the hunter replied. "That evidence is in your possession now. 3 independent biologists will receive the same documentation today. So will the oversight committee contact I mentioned." The journalist nodded, understanding the security protocols established in their earlier communications. Multiple independent channels, redundant documentation, scientific verification before public disclosure. "The facility locations are precisely mapped," the hunter continued. "Both the crash site and the underground installation. Historical connections dating to at least the 1970s. Evidence of similar incidents suppressed over decades. And the immediate threat to you personally?" The hunter glanced toward the window, scanning the parking lot before responding. "They know I was there last night. Know I documented the operation. Likely know my identity by now, though I took precautions. The evidence being public offers some protection, but agencies operating at this level have resources beyond conventional constraints," the journalist finished. "My organization has experience with whistleblower protection. Secure accommodations, legal counsel, identity management if necessary." The hunter shook his head slightly. "I'm not leaving my family or my home, but I've ensured the evidence exists independently of my personal safety. Multiple distribution points triggered automatically if I don't check in according to established protocols." The journalist studied him for a moment, then nodded with professional respect. 48 hours for preliminary verification. Then simultaneous release across multiple platforms, major networks, international outlets, scientific journals. Too dispersed to contain, and too significant to ignore, the hunter added. Their meeting concluded within 15 minutes. Brief enough to avoid attention, yet sufficient to transfer all necessary materials and confirm the distribution strategy. The hunter watched from his truck as the journalist drove away, carrying with her evidence that would irrevocably change humanity's understanding of life in the universe. Over the next 36 hours, the hunter maintained his normal routines, equipment maintenance, correspondence with clients, family dinner, while monitoring multiple communication channels. The journalist's preliminary analysis confirmed his findings. The biological material documented in his photographs and video exhibited cellular structures and organizational patterns inconsistent with any known terrestrial life form. 3 independent biologists consulted on anonymized samples reached the same conclusion. The story broke simultaneously across 6 major news outlets on the morning of the 3rd day. Headlines varied in their specificity, but conveyed the essential revelation. Classified government program concealing non-terrestrial biological discoveries. Decades-long cover-up of extraterrestrial biological materials exposed. Hunter's discovery in National Forest reveals secret government containment of alien biological specimens. The hunter watched the initial coverage from his home office, multiple screens displaying different networks' treatment of the story. The journalist had handled the material expertly, presenting comprehensive evidence while protecting his identity, referred to only as an experienced wildlife professional with decades of experience in the region. Public reaction unfolded in predictable waves. Initial skepticism, followed by stunned acceptance as scientific experts confirmed the authenticity of the evidence, culminating in widespread demand for government transparency and congressional investigation. Social media platforms exploded with discussion, analysis, and speculation about the implications of confirming biological material of non-terrestrial origin. Official response evolved just as predictably. Initial denial, followed by acknowledgement of classified research programs involving unconventional biological samples, finally giving way to formal statements announcing the establishment of a special congressional investigation committee and the deployment of FBI evidence response teams to the locations identified in the hunter's documentation. By sunset on the fourth day, the entire national forest area surrounding the facility had been closed to the public. Local residents reported convoys of government vehicles, FBI, Department of Energy, military, streaming toward the region. Satellite imagery circulated online showed extensive activity at the precise coordinates the hunter had documented, with temporary structures being erected and a full perimeter established around the underground facility. The hunter observed this activity from the vantage point of a public overlook several miles from the operation. Other citizens and several news crews had gathered there as well, telephoto lenses trained on the distant commotion. The scene below, now illuminated by powerful floodlights as darkness fell, represented the end of a secret kept for decades and the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. A sense of profound completion settled over the hunter as he watched. The risks had been necessary. The threats would likely continue. Powerful interests didn't simply abandon decades of secrecy without resistance, but the truth was now irrevocably public, documented across too many independent channels to be recaptured or contained. His satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message from the journalist. Congressional hearing scheduled next week. Your testimony requested but anonymous participation arranged if preferred. Full protection guaranteed. The hunter typed a simple reply. We'll testify publicly. Truth deserves a face and a voice. As he drove home through the gathering darkness, the hunter reflected on how a routine expedition had transformed into the most consequential journey of his life. He had entered the forest seeking game and emerged with a discovery that would reshape humanity's understanding of life itself. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with public scrutiny, potential danger, and profound questions about what other secrets might remain hidden in remote corners of the world. But tonight, for the first time since stumbling upon that crashed helicopter, the tension in his shoulders had relaxed. The weight of solitary knowledge had been lifted. Whatever came next, he had fulfilled the most fundamental responsibility of his discovery, ensuring that the truth, however extraordinary, would not remain buried in the woods. The congressional hearing room buzzed with tension as the hunter approached the witness table. 6 weeks had passed since his discovery had erupted into national headlines, transforming a classified government program hidden for decades into the most significant public disclosure since the Pentagon Papers. The cavernous chamber was filled beyond capacity. Committee members arranged in a semicircle before him. Media representatives crowded into designated areas. Public observers packed into every available seat. The hunter took his seat, adjusting the microphone with weathered hands that had tracked game through mountain passes but now found themselves at the center of national attention. Despite multiple offers for anonymity, he had chosen to testify openly. Truth required both evidence and testimony. Documents alone were insufficient. Please state your name and occupation for the record, the committee chairperson requested. A senior senator whose expression revealed the strain of overseeing revelations that crossed multiple administrations and challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's solitary existence. The hunter provided his name for the first time in the public record, identifying himself as a professional hunting guide and wildlife photographer with 23 years of experience in the northwestern Montana wilderness. What followed was 3 hours of methodical testimony, the hunter recounting his initial discovery of the crashed helicopter, the biological material in the containment unit, the hidden facility, the historical documentation dating back decades, and finally the night operation he had witnessed and documented. His testimony was supported by hundreds of photographs, video recordings, and the soil samples that 3 independent laboratories had now confirmed contained molecular structures inconsistent with known terrestrial biology. The committee's questioning revealed the extraordinary scale of what had been uncovered. The classified program, officially designated Biological Assessment and Containment Protocol, had operated continuously since 1968 under the oversight of a specialized multi-agency task force. What had begun as analysis of unusual biological samples recovered from a remote crash site had evolved into an extensive containment and research operation with facilities in 7 states, all concealed beneath cover stories ranging from environmental monitoring to geological research. Documents obtained through congressional subpoena confirmed the hunters' discoveries were merely the visible edge of a much larger operation. The biological material, now officially acknowledged as of probable non-terrestrial origin in the committee's preliminary findings, had been the subject of intensive study for over 50 years, yielding breakthroughs in multiple scientific fields, while remaining classified at the highest levels of national security. "What we're establishing today," the committee chair stated during a particularly tense exchange with a former Defense Department official, "is not merely the existence of this material or the classification of the research program, but the systematic intimidation of civilians and the deliberate misleading of Congress regarding operations on public lands." The investigation had already produced significant consequences. 3 senior officials from the program's Oversight Committee had been indicted for perjury before Congress. The Forest Service supervisor, who had attempted to discourage the hunters' reporting, faced charges for obstruction of justice. Most significantly, a former director of special access programs had been arrested for authorizing illegal surveillance and intimidation tactics against civilians who had stumbled upon program activities. The hunter watched these proceedings with a complex mix of vindication and concern. The truth had emerged, not just about the biological discoveries, but about the institutional corruption required to maintain such secrecy. Yet the implications extended far beyond criminal accountability for specific individuals. The public was now grappling with scientific evidence suggesting humanity was not alone in the universe, and that government agencies had concealed this reality for generations. Outside the hearing room, public reaction had evolved from initial shock to sustained demand for transparency. Demonstrations in major cities called for declassification of all related research. Scientific institutions worldwide requested access to the biological samples for independent analysis. Religious leaders convened emergency councils to address theological implications, while philosophers debated the ethical dimensions of withholding such profound knowledge from humanity. The hunters' rural community had not escaped the upheaval. What had been a quiet mountain town was now regularly visited by journalists, researchers, and curious tourists. The Forest Service office, where he had first reported the crash, was now a temporary field headquarters for the FBI's evidence recovery operation. Local businesses displayed newspaper headlines about the discovery that changed everything, featuring the hunters' testimony transcripts beneath grainy photos of the recovered biological material. Most significant was the transformation at the crash site itself. What had been an isolated clearing in the national forest was now the center of a joint scientific and investigative operation involving multiple federal agencies. The underground facility had been fully exposed, revealing an extensive complex extending nearly 300 feet into the mountainside, with specialized laboratories, containment areas, and data centers dedicated to analyzing the non-terrestrial biological material. As the congressional hearing concluded its first phase, the committee chair addressed the hunter directly. "Your persistence in pursuing this matter despite significant personal risk represents the highest ideals of civic responsibility. This committee recognizes that you could have walked away, could have dismissed what you found, or surrendered to threats against your safety. Your choice to document everything methodically and ensure its public disclosure has forced our nation to confront both an extraordinary scientific reality and the institutional failures that kept it hidden." The hunter nodded in acknowledgement, uncomfortable with praise, but recognizing its importance in the official record. The truth had been his only objective, and now that truth was permanently established, too thoroughly documented and widely distributed to ever be buried again. The state capitol building stood majestically against a clear autumn sky as hundreds gathered on its broad steps for the special recognition ceremony. The governor of Montana had organized the event not merely to honor the hunters' role in exposing the classified program, but to formally recognize all who had attempted to document similar discoveries over the decades, many of whom had been dismissed, intimidated, or worse. The hunter stood uncomfortably on the platform among state officials, scientific authorities, and family members of those who had previously encountered the program's activities. He had selected his simplest clothing, the same field jacket and work pants he would wear on any typical day in the forest, rather than the formal attire suggested by the governor's staff. His weathered appearance stood in stark contrast to the polished officials surrounding him, yet somehow embodied the authenticity that had made his testimony so compelling. Today we recognize not just an extraordinary discovery, but the courage required to ensure that discovery reached the public despite powerful interests working to prevent exactly that outcome. The governor began, addressing the assembled crowd and the national media covering the event. For more than 50 years, individuals in this region encountered evidence of activities they could not explain. Lights in the sky, unmarked aircraft, unusual security operations in public forests. Many documented what they witnessed. Some reported their observations to authorities. A few persisted, despite official dismissal or active discouragement. The governor gestured toward a memorial plaque being unveiled at the ceremony. This monument acknowledges those whose attempts to bring truth forward were suppressed. The former Forest Service ranger whose journals documented the original facility construction in 1977. The flight instructor whose radar recordings of unusual aerial phenomena were confiscated in 1983. The environmental scientist whose soil samples showing anomalous molecular structures were dismissed as contaminated in 1992. And most tragically, the 3 local residents who died in suspicious circumstances after reporting encounters with program operations. The hunter studied the plaque solemnly, recognizing that his success in exposing the truth rested partly on the groundwork laid by these previous witnesses. Unlike them, he had benefited from modern technology, satellite phones, digital cameras, encrypted cloud storage that made evidence suppression far more difficult. His timing had aligned with an era when information could be dispersed globally within hours, beyond the reach of even the most powerful government agencies. When called to speak, the hunter approached the microphone with visible reluctance. Public speaking had never been his domain. The forests and mountains were where he expressed himself most naturally, yet he recognized the responsibility of this moment. "I'm not comfortable with recognition," he began, his voice carrying the same measured cadence he used when instructing clients on wilderness navigation. "What I found by accident. What I did afterward, documenting everything, securing the evidence, ensuring its public disclosure was simply what responsibility demanded. The real recognition belongs to those who tried before me and were silenced." He paused, gathering thoughts that had crystallized during the weeks of testimony and investigation. What happened in those woods reflects 2 competing human instincts. The instinct to discover and understand, represented by the scientists who studied this extraordinary biological material for decades, and the instinct to control and conceal, represented by those who decided humanity wasn't ready for the truth. The hunter gestured toward the mountains visible in the distance beyond the Capitol building. The systems that allowed this concealment to continue for generations failed all of us. They failed the public's right to knowledge. They failed the scientific community's need for open inquiry. They even failed the researchers who worked in isolation without the benefit of global scientific collaboration. His voice gained strength as he continued, no longer the reluctant public figure but the experienced guide accustomed to leading others through challenging terrain. But systems are made of people making choices. At every step in this program's history, individuals chose secrecy over transparency, intimidation over engagement, institutional protection over public interest. Different choices were always possible. The hunter concluded by addressing not the officials beside him, or the media recording his words, but the ordinary citizens gathered on the Capitol steps. "The truth about what I found matters not because it's sensational or unprecedented, but because it belongs to all of us. Knowledge of our place in the universe isn't the property of any government or agency. It's the collective inheritance of humanity." The ceremony continued with additional speakers and formal presentations, but the hunter found himself increasingly withdrawn, processing the emotional weight that had accumulated over the months since his discovery. The public validation represented by this event stood in sharp contrast to the isolation he had felt during those initial days of documenting the crash site and hidden facility, uncertain whether anyone would believe what he had found or support his effort to expose it. Later, as the crowds dispersed, the hunter found a quiet moment with the daughter of the Forest Service ranger, whose journals had documented the original facility. Now, in her 60s, she carried her father's weathered leather field book, the counterpart to the journal preserved in the Historical Society. He would have been grateful, she said simply, to know he wasn't imagining things, that what he saw was real, that someone finally made others see it too. The hunter nodded, understanding that beyond the scientific implications and political consequences, his discovery had provided a more personal vindication for those whose experiences had been dismissed for decades. In this, perhaps, lay the most meaningful impact of all. Winter settled over the mountains with characteristic severity, blanketing the forest in snow that transformed familiar landscapes into something pristine and unfamiliar. 3 months after his congressional testimony, the hunter returned to his professional routines: equipment maintenance, correspondence with clients for the spring season, trail camera monitoring for wildlife research projects. Yet nothing was truly the same. His relationship with the forest had fundamentally changed, colored now by awareness of what had remained hidden there for decades. Each familiar ridge and valley carried new significance. Each unmarked access road raised questions about what might lie at its end. The media attention had gradually subsided as the investigation became institutionalized. A permanent scientific commission had been established to analyze the biological material and related research data. Congressional oversight committees continued their examination of the program's history and authorization chain. The news cycle had moved on to other crises and controversies. Though documentary producers still occasionally contacted the hunter for interviews, he politely declined. His family had weathered the upheaval with remarkable resilience. His wife had supported his decision to testify publicly despite the risks and disruption. Their daughter had temporarily returned from her environmental studies program to help manage the flood of media inquiries. Their son had shown particular interest in the scientific implications, spending hours discussing the biological analyses with his father each evening. On a clear February morning, the hunter prepared for what had become a monthly ritual, a solitary expedition to monitor the ongoing work at both the crash site and the underground facility. Though both locations remained under federal jurisdiction, his status as the primary witness had earned him unusual access privileges. He used these visits not for additional documentation but for personal processing, reconciling his familiar wilderness with the extraordinary events now permanently associated with it. The crash site had been completely excavated. The helicopter remains transported to specialized research facilities for comprehensive analysis. What remained was a precisely mapped archaeological dig, with researchers meticulously documenting soil samples at various depths and distances from the impact point. The hunter observed their work from the tree line, noting the contrast between their methodical scientific approach and his initial shocked documentation. The underground facility presented a more dramatic transformation. What had been a concealed bunker was now a fully exposed research installation, its extensive subterranean levels revealed through controlled excavation. Multiple agencies maintained continuous operations there, analyzing systems, recovering documents, and mapping connections to other program facilities nationwide. The hunter was permitted brief access to the main laboratory level, now stripped of its most sensitive equipment but still bearing evidence of its original purpose. The room where he had observed the containment units being transferred still contained the mounting brackets and power systems that had sustained them. Technical diagrams on the walls illustrated biological structures unlike anything in textbooks, cellular organizations that defied conventional taxonomic classifications. A young researcher approached as the hunter studied these diagrams, offering context that hadn't been available during his original discovery. The program documented 7 distinct recovery incidents between 1968 and 2019, the scientist explained. Each yielded biological material with similar cellular characteristics, but distinct organizational patterns. The working hypothesis was evolutionary adaptation to different environmental conditions. They knew it was non-terrestrial? The hunter asked. The earliest analysis established that conclusively. The molecular structures utilize elements common on Earth but in configurations that don't occur naturally in our biosphere. The researcher hesitated. What's remarkable isn't just the origin, but that they kept it contained for so long. The scientific implications alone, for medicine, for materials science, for our understanding of biological possibilities, are revolutionary. The hunter nodded, having reached a similar conclusion months earlier. The concealment represented not just institutional secrecy, but a fundamental withholding of knowledge that might have transformed human understanding and capability. Later that afternoon, the hunter hiked to a remote ridgeline overlooking both sites, his personal observation post from that pivotal night when he had documented the transfer operation. Fresh snow crunched beneath his boots as he reached the rocky outcropping where he had established his position. The forest spread below him, winter bare branches creating complex patterns against the snow. He sat on the same boulder where he had positioned his equipment that night, allowing memories to flow through him without resistance. The tension of the approach, the revelation of seeing the biological material clearly for the first time, the controlled panic of evading pursuit through familiar terrain suddenly rendered dangerous. The hunter extracted a small metal container from his pack, a ceremonial gesture he had planned for this visit. Inside lay fragments he had collected during his original documentation: a pine needle from beside the crashed helicopter, a small stone from the facility entrance, a handwritten note recording his first impressions. He arranged these items carefully on the snow-covered boulder, a private memorial to the moment his understanding of the world had fundamentally changed. "Still coming to terms with it?" a voice asked from behind him. The hunter turned to find the FBI special agent who coordinated the ongoing investigation standing several yards away, having followed his tracks to this isolated vantage point. "Some days more than others," the hunter acknowledged. The agent nodded, approaching to stand beside him at the overlook. The program directors were convinced public knowledge would trigger panic, religious crises, institutional collapse. They believed secrecy was protective. "And your assessment?" the hunter asked. "Look around." The agent gestured toward the valley below, where research operations continued normally, despite the extraordinary nature of their subject. 6 months of public knowledge. Society continues functioning. Religious institutions are adapting their interpretations. Scientific progress is accelerating rather than collapsing. The hunter considered this. Yet some questions remain unanswered. Many, the agent confirmed. Origin, purpose, whether there's connection to reported aerial phenomena, whether similar biological material exists elsewhere. Some answers may never be found. The acknowledgement of persistent mystery brought the hunter an unexpected sense of peace. The truth he had exposed was significant but incomplete, as all human knowledge must be. His responsibility had been to ensure that the pursuit of answers continued openly rather than behind locked doors, allowing humanity to collectively grapple with implications too profound for any single institution to address. As shadows lengthened across the snow-covered landscape, the agent departed, leaving the hunter alone with the wilderness that had both concealed and revealed one of humanity's most significant discoveries. The forest in winter twilight held its familiar beauty, indifferent to the extraordinary revelations now associated with it, continuing its seasonal cycles as it had for millennia before human intervention and would for millennia after. Spring arrived in the mountains with its characteristic blend of renewal and revelation. Snowmelt exposed the forest floor, returning color and texture to landscapes that had been monochrome for months. The hunter moved through familiar terrain on the first morning of turkey season, alert to the subtle signs of wildlife returning to established patterns. The forest smelled of damp earth and new growth, pine sap and decomposing leaves, the same scents that had greeted him that autumn morning when he first detected something foreign in the air. He paused at the crest of a small rise, wetting his finger to check wind direction just as he had done countless times before, including on that pivotal day. Yet this forest, though physically unchanged, existed now in a different reality. Humanity walked with newfound awareness of its place in a universe more complex and populated than previous generations had acknowledged. The knowledge that had been concealed in these woods for decades now belonged to everyone, discussed in classrooms, debated in legislatures, explored in laboratories worldwide. The hunter moved with practiced silence through the familiar terrain, his perspective fundamentally altered, yet his connection to this landscape undiminished. The trees that had witnessed his discovery still stood. The game trails he had followed still wound through underbrush. The silence that had warned him of something amiss still communicated when properly interpreted. He reached a clearing where spring sunlight illuminated new growth emerging from soil that had been frozen for months. Life persisting, adapting, continuing. A process now understood to extend beyond the boundaries of a single planet. The hunter knelt to examine a turkey track pressed into damp earth, evidence of the ordinary continuing alongside the extraordinary. The forest had always been a place of discovery for those patient enough to observe its patterns and humble enough to acknowledge its mysteries. That fundamental truth remained unchanged, even as the scope of what might be discovered had expanded beyond what anyone in these mountains could previously have imagined. The hunter rose and continued along the ridge, moving forward both physically and metaphorically. The search for truth, whether tracking game through mountain passes or documenting evidence of non-terrestrial life, required the same essential qualities: persistence, attention to detail, and willingness to follow evidence wherever it led. Some mysteries remained, as they always would. Some questions awaited future discoveries, as they should. But the hunter had fulfilled his responsibility to ensure that humanity's search for understanding continued in the light of shared knowledge, rather than the darkness of institutional secrecy. He paused at the edge of the tree line, looking out over the valley where his accidental discovery had altered the course of human understanding. A turkey called in the distance, life continuing in its ancient patterns while human knowledge evolved in unprecedented ways. The hunter smiled slightly and moved forward into the forest, ready for whatever revelations awaited those willing to observe closely and act with conviction. Truth, like the wilderness, revealed itself only to those prepared to navigate its terrain with both caution and courage. Don't forget to subscribe for more investigative thrillers that reveal the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. New episodes every day.